I want to welcome you all. It's good to see so many people here. The event is sold out. Half the crowd is over at Harbor Center, and half the crowd is here, but I'm sure they're going to be working their way in here as we proceed. So I'm really looking forward to the next day and a half or 2 days, and I think we're going to get a chance to know each other, and we're going to have a very stimulating conversation. I'm going to give you a little background on myself. First of all, this is the first conference I've organized, and I have immense respect for conference organizers now. My main task in life seems to be as a psychotherapist, which is what I've been doing for the last 44 years. I became involved, or I became familiar with Ernest Becker's work when I worked at the Maples some 44 years ago. It was a treatment center for severely disturbed adolescents, and a couple of the staff that were working there with me were, one of them was a student of Becker's, the other was a TA with Becker. So that they introduced me to his, said there's a book you should have a look at. The next connection I had with the Becker Foundation was through I was an associate of the Institute of Humanities, and we'd have an annual symposium at Bowen Island to discuss issues of violence. And our inaugural symposium was attended by Neil Elgee, who is the founder of the Ernest Becker Foundation, and Sheldon Solomon, who's our keynote speaker tonight. And our lives have been weaving together ever since. I try to make it down to Seattle whenever Sheldon's there, because there's always something fresh in what he has to say, and I'm sure he'll have something fresh to tell us tonight. The next contact, or the next involvement, I proposed to do a course, a 6-week course to Simon Fraser's Continuing Studies program on Ernest Becker's work, and it was the 44 people signed up for it, very interesting people signed up for it. It was a cohort that was at least 55 years or older, so I think the topic of death had some salience for them and for me. And then because of how much I enjoyed that and how much the people in the group seemed to enjoy it, I approached Samir, who's the director of the Institute of Humanities, and I suggested we do this conference, and he gave an enthusiastic thumbs up, and it coincided with Simon Fraser's 50th anniversary, so it was a nice convergence of forces. Okay, so before I'm going to go any further, I want to acknowledge that this conference is taking place on unceded land, and I've asked a representative of the Musqueam Nation to do our opening welcoming protocol. So if Cecilia, if you could come forward.
Asiam nasieya, anta Cecilia Point talitsanatla homasquiam, amitsap quapquilam. My name's Cecilia Point from the Musqueam First Nation. I really welcome you here today to this event. And I was trying to wrap my head around what's taking place at the conference and how my culture kind of views pre-life, life, death, what we're here for. And to us, our ancestors are a huge part of our lives. And so it's not so much about a bucket list as it is about what we're going to leave for the next 7 generations. And I was just yesterday with all of the chiefs who are standing up against Enbridge, and I had to introduce them to welcome them to our territory. And oh my goodness, just standing there feeling all of their ancestors with me. And how different it is from suburban life. I mean, I grew up in suburbia as a housewife, a hockey mom. And in 2012, I was called by my community to speak for the ancestors. And I think the only reason that happened was my late father, was a great speaker, and I think that they called me because of him. And I received many gifts from him after he left this earth. He was a residential school survivor. He was terribly abused when he was here on earth. And he had two personalities. He was very jovial, or else he was very violent and angry. So as a child, I spent a lot of time like hiding under a bed or hiding in a closet. At a certain point, I stopped talking. And eventually, unfortunately, drugs and alcohol brought me out of that when I was like 12, 13 years old. And so it's been a huge journey. Like in my late 20s and early 30s, everything started turning around. And I think that's what we're here for, to have this journey. You know, a lot of things are going to happen to us, and we're going to learn from them. And so I think while you're here on earth, ground yourself. We have the beautiful mountains, the two sisters, the lions. Sit on the ground sometime and look up at them. Even on your coffee break, if you have 10, 15 minutes, go out and sit on the ground. We're surrounded by water. The huge whales are coming back into the local water here, and they're sending you a message. Protect this place for the next 7 generations. Look at us, we're still here. So what happened in 2012, we had a gravesite that suddenly became under threat, and they were going to build condos on it. And there was hundreds of bodies buried there. And they started digging up the bodies. And they dug up 2 adults and 2 infants. And so that was my family, 2 adults and 2 children. And some of our elders said the infants were sitting up in their beds crying, and they wanted us to come and help them. So those ancestors are still with us. And my mother was Irish, and so much of the culture is so similar, I mean, aside from the Catholicism. But the rituals, the drums, the singing, and when my father passed, so many people surrounded him, like his hospital room was crammed with people out in the waiting room, and people were coming in smudging and putting water and brushing cedar. And then when I went to my mother, she passed away and went back to Ireland, and her room was full of so many people crammed in there and putting amulets, and a priest came with incense, and there was holy water, and I just went, wow, so many of this is the same. And while you were sitting there, you could feel her going in and out. And my dad was shape-shifting. He was in his bed, turning into a whale and turning back into himself. And you can feel it. So I ask you to feel it and not be afraid of what's on the other side and then what's coming up, the next 7 generations. Keep this place beautiful for them, and then you've done your work on this earth. So I'm going to sing the paddle song today, because when visitors are coming, our warriors go out in their canoes onto the water and see who's coming. Or if they're coming by land, we have runners. We used to have villages. So there was a village like at the tip of UBC, and someone would light a fire. Someone on the island across would light a fire, and you could see who was coming, and we sent runners. So we would sing the paddle song when they were coming, and sometimes they would sing their paddle song and announce that they were coming. So when we send someone off at their funeral, we all sing the paddle song for them. So I want you to take the paddle song today on your journey going forward, and think about what you're going to do while you're here. Osiam.
He
Thank you so much. As I was listening to that, I was reminded, please come in. Anybody who's arrived late, this is your chance to come and find a spot to sit. The seats up at the front are filled, but there are some spaces over here. I'm just going to take a couple of moments here. I think I'm going to quote, I think this is an Ernest Becker quote, but I'm not absolutely sure where I found it, but I think it sort of speaks to some of the aspects that Cecilia was pointing to. I think he said, real generosity towards the future lies in giving all to the present. And as I listened to Cecilia, I thought, we are standing on the shoulders of giants, our ancestors, and who's going to stand on our shoulders? So I think she gave us a very good attitude towards that. So now I'd like to thank some of the sponsoring people, agencies that made this possible. First and foremost, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, also the Institute of Humanities. The Ernest Becker Foundation also helped us out considerably. J.S. Woodsworth Chair made a donation, and the Department of Psychology. This wouldn't have happened without all their help. I'd like to make a few individual introductions, people that are noteworthy and you might want to talk to at some point during the conference. I've already mentioned Neil Elgee, who founded the Ernest Becker Foundation. If you want to stand up, Neil, and take a bow or wave to people. This is Neil here. Yeah. Sitting right next to him is Marie Becker, who is self-advertised as Ernest Becker's oldest living legacy. Maria has quite a sense of humor. She's also an artist as well, so if you get a chance, she's a very enjoyable person to talk to. Sheldon Solomon is here somewhere, sitting on the floor over there. He's the man with the short pants, and you're in for a treat. Let's see if there's anybody else. Yes. Deborah Jacobs, have you found us yet? Hi, Deborah. She's with the Ernest Becker Foundation. She's the executive director. She got a little bit lost, but I'm glad you've found your way here. And Krista Masson is, yes. So if you want to talk to anybody who's involved with that organization, they're at the back of the room. I think I've introduced everybody. And now I'd like to introduce John Craig, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I heard John give some introductory remarks at the Frankfurt School. There was a conference looking at the Frankfurt School legacy, and of course there were formalities, and John was asked to give his welcoming remarks, and I was very pleased to hear his comments about in today's university it's very difficult at times to honor the traditional mandate of the university, which entails some social criticism. So I felt very supported, and I felt the people who were presenting there were very supported. I'm going to give you a little background on John. He got his initial, he was a professor in early modern English history. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Simon Fraser. He was born in Wrexham, England, and emigrated to Canada with his parents in the 70s. He completed his secondary schooling here and then completed both his BA and MA at Carleton University in Ottawa. In 1968, he became a research student at Cambridge University, Peterhouse, and was awarded a doctoral degree in 1992 and elected to a research fellowship at Robinson College. In 1994, he took up a position at Simon Fraser as an assistant professor. In no time at all, he was promoted to full professor in 2005 and served as a chair of the Department of History from then to 2008 when he was appointed Dean of the Faculty in 2010. and I understand he's going to be retiring very soon. So congratulations for that. Okay, John, over to you.
Larry, thanks very much. Far too much information. And people who know Wrexham, the Welsh of Wrexham, would be appalled to hear that Wrexham is in England. But Larry, that's enormously kind of you. I think actually all administrators should watch on a regular basis this fantastic film, Shakespeare in Love. I say that not simply because I work on the 16th and 17th centuries and I spend more time sort of thinking with Shakespeare about questions of death. I'm certainly not a student of Ernest Becker. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I really was introduced to Ernest Becker thanks to Jack Martin and that fantastic article that he wrote, Ernest Becker at Simon Fraser University. And that really started, I think, this conversation. And Larry, thank you so much for all of your work with this conference. But I just want to take you back for a minute to this wonderful moment. Those of you who don't know the film, watch the film. The script writing is by Tom Stoppard and Mark Norman. It's very, very clever. They know their Shakespeare well. So Hugh Fennyman is this rather hard-nosed, grasping producer of plays. And he has an interaction with Edward Allen. And Edward Allen was a real person. He was a fantastic actor, celebrated actor. I mean, he was the... I don't know. I don't really live in the year 2015, which is my problem. But so I don't know who it might be. Maybe, I don't know, the Benedict Cumberbatch of his day, right? And at a certain point, you know, Shakespeare's trying to come up with a play which he thought he was going to call it Ethel and the Pirate Maiden or something like this. And then Ned Allen and the Admiral's men come to the theatre, and there's been this exchange between Hugh Fennyman, this grasping producer, and the other actors, telling him essentially that actors are 10 a penny, and that he has, forgive my crude language, their nuts in his hands, and they will do whatever he said. And then in comes Ned Allen, and he says, you know, the Admiral's men are returned. And Fennyman sort of says, well, who is this? Who is this? And Allen says, you know, dog, I am Tamburlaine. I'm Faustus. I am the Jew of Malta. Then he remembers, all that's Marlowe's work, right? Then he remembers that, yes, he's in the presence of Shakespeare. Oh, yes, and Master Shakespeare, I'm also Henry VI, Part 1. Thank you for that. And, you know, essentially he's saying, you know, the great man's come. What is the play? And what is my part? And then Fennyman, the producer, says, 1 moment, sir. And Allen, who are you? And Fennyman says, I'm the money. And at that point, then Allen says, then you may remain, so long as you remain silent. Pay attention, you will see how genius creates a legend. And I think what's so important for administrators to hear is that if you are supplying some funding, we may remain, so long as we remain silent, and just get out of the way, really. And I think that's so important. I think that's so important. And one of the reasons why it's so easy when Larry comes calling and Samir Gandesha comes calling and Jack Martin comes calling, and they say, look, you've never heard really of Ernest Becker, but he was a tremendously important colleague and scholar here with a hugely important legacy. Give us some cash. Then it became so easy to say yes to that. And Larry's already thanked the variety of other people, the Ernest Becker Foundation, the J.S. Woodsworth Chair. I just want to echo that. We won't go through the whole list once again. But a very, very warm welcome. I think we're in for a treat tonight. You've got all day tomorrow with tremendous presentations and opportunities to discuss. So welcome to all of you, to Simon Fraser, to the Woodward, if you like, space of Simon Fraser. And I think in some ways, I'm not that actually interested in the fact that SFU is turning 50. It's a kind of interesting marker in some ways. I'm glad that we are doing this. In some ways, it's enormously melancholy because those of you who know Becker well are mindful that he didn't live to reach his 50th birthday. He died when he was only 49. And so it's both, in some ways, an appropriately melancholy moment to reflect upon his life, his legacy. So under the title of Death, Ideologies and Culture, the Legacy of Ernest Becker, I'm delighted to see all of you here. Those of you who know SFU well, some of you who have been here at this university from the early days, you know there are a number of things that are wrong about this place. And yet, and I can say these things because I've only got a few months left, and it's, my colleagues did prevail on me to take on another term as dean, but I thought it was going to be utterly soul-destroying. And it hasn't all been miserable, don't get me wrong. There are moments like these where I can just kind of hang loose. So there are a number of challenges that this young university faces, but I, for one, am very, very conscious of how privileged we are, those of us who work at universities like Simon Fraser, those of us who have an association with a university like Simon Fraser, and there are plenty of other good universities as well. But these remain enormously privileged spaces where, with goodwill, we have opportunities to think, to reflect, to instruct, to discuss, to engage in dialogue, and that's exactly what needs to happen. And I trust that I know that that's going to happen tonight, and it's going to continue over tomorrow. And I, for one, though I'm going to be moving back happily to the department, I'm looking forward to playing my part in ensuring that the next number of 50 years, I'm 51 now, I'm aiming for 110, so I'm not quite middle-aged. But I wanted to leave you with, even though I reflect quite a bit on Shakespeare and Shakespeare's reflections on that undiscovered country. I came late. It's only happened over the past couple of years that I've been reading a bit more of Larkin's poetry that he wrote towards the end of his life. And as I've had occasion just to read some of the material and do a little bit of reading into Becker's work, I have thought, what would that conversation have been like if those two men, very much of the same generation, Larkin was born in 1922, died in 85, if they'd had occasion to meet and to discuss. And I leave you with this little poem as a way in to an introduction in Sheldon. It's called The Mower. He writes this, some of you will know Larkin as the vinegary writer, saying rather rude things about parents. But here he is in a rather more tender moment, reflecting on loss, reflecting on death. Many of you will know this. It's called The Mower. If you don't know it, take this as a little gift. The Mower. The mower stalled twice. Kneeling, I found a hedgehog jammed up against the blades, killed. It had been in the long grass. I had seen it before and even fed it once. Now I had mauled its unobtrusive world unmendably. Burial was no help. Next morning I got up, and it did not. The first day after a death, the new absence is always the same. We should be careful of each other. We should be kind while there is still time. Thanks very much.
Pretty amazing. I think we can stop there. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to say a few more words about the conference. I'm going to give you a little overview of the conference. I want to make it clear, in spite of what John said, that this conference isn't exclusively about death, although we will be talking about it, but it's more about the denial of death and the cost of that denial. So perhaps talking about the denial of death is just another clever way of avoiding death itself. I'm not sure. But we'll be spending a lot of time doing that. At least most of us will be talking about death in a personal way, but there will be a couple of speakers who will also be addressing collective death, the collective death that's possible with global warming and climate change. So I think that needs to be addressed as well. I think if there's an overarching theme for this conference, it would be to make us aware of the damage that we do to ourselves and to others when we deny our mortality. So I think we'll be paying attention to the cost, or we'll be much more aware of the cost of that denial by the end of this conference. And perhaps we'll find some ways to come to peace and acceptance with it. And I think that poem by Larkin was a good start. So for the rest of the evening, You're going to be spending time listening to Sheldon, as I've already said about 12 times, and John's repeated. But I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview about what's going to happen for the rest of the conference. Tomorrow we're going to start off with Jack Martin, and Jack Martin will clarify and express many of Becker's ideas, but he'll situate it within a biographical framework, specifically with Becker's time here at Simon Fraser. Jack will be followed by a presentation by David Loy, who's a Buddhist scholar, and he'll be showing us, as I recall reading Becker, there was always a place implicit sometimes, explicit at other times for the sacred. And I think David Loy will bring that sacred presence forward in his talk, looking at Buddhism as a path or as a shield or an umbrella. In the afternoon, we're going to have a couple of panel discussions. One of those panel discussions will go into greater detail about the cost of denial, death, and how we protect ourselves by identifying with the current values of our culture, and perhaps how we can release our death grip on those meanings and open up to a more generous way of being with one another. The second panel discussion will look at death itself. We'll have a nurse, oncologist who works in oncology. She'll be talking about her PhD research and physicians' attitudes towards death and how that affected the way they practice. And at the end of the day, you'll be full to the brim. Your minds will be filled to the brim. Even though we'll have opportunities for questions and answers, I'd like to give us all an opportunity to have small group discussions where you can process some of the things that you've heard, ask some questions, state some opinions, and get to know each other a little bit better. So that'll be the final thing that'll happen tomorrow, and we'll close with that. There will be no closing remarks, and then we'll reconvene on Sunday morning. So I think that's about it. There's not going to be a dance tomorrow night, so all you joyful skeletons will have to dance at some other venue. There wasn't enough interest expressed, so that's why it had to be canceled. And I'm going to conclude my remarks before introducing Sheldon with a little story about a man who was experiencing some health symptoms and decided to go to his doctor and just get it checked out. He was a proactive kind of a guy, so he went to the doctor, explained his symptoms, and asked him to run a few tests, and the doctor was pleased to oblige. So about a week later, the doctor phones him up and says, okay, the results are in, and I've got some bad news and good news. What do you want to hear first? So the guy pauses for a moment, and he says, well, give me the good news. And the doctor said, well, you've got 24 hours to live. And the guy says, what? What could be worse than that? And the doctor said, I was supposed to phone you yesterday. I've told that joke a number of times just to see how well it would go over, and every time I laugh a lot. And I think the reason I laugh is because that punchline brings death right up. We always like to have a gap between our contemplation of death in some unforeseeable future, and that punchline brings it right to our face. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sheldon.
Thank you, and thank you, that was awesome. And thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I feel awkward a little bit being thrust in the position of doing like a keynote talk. And I know I've seen some of you all before. You all look vaguely familiar at this point, but a few years ago, that's like 20 years ago, Neil asked me to do a keynote talk for one of our Ernest Becker Foundation presentations, and I was telling my family, I had 2 kids. I still do, but they're bigger than me. They look down on me literally and figuratively now, but they were small at the time. And I was like, oh, I have to go to Seattle to do the Keynote Talk. And my son, kind of a wise ass, if you'll pardon the expression, was about 4 years old. And he's like, oh, Keynote, I can do that. And he ran over to the piano and he just hit the middle C on the piano. He's like, all right, that's it. And yet I think there's something symbolically appropriate about that, particularly for this particular enterprise where we're here to exchange ideas in the service of commemorating the legacy of Ernest Becker's ideas. I'm happy to serve as the talking head of sorts to give you an overview of ideas that I know many of you are very familiar with and tell you a little bit about the research that we've done over the decades to provide empirical support for those notions. But for the most part, I hope to just set a good tone and not be too intrusive, as it were, because I think the main events are tomorrow, and I think the best part of this is going to be when we get to see each other more directly and get to know each other a little bit. All right, so with that in mind, since antiquity, I think, although I wasn't there, I'm told that philosophers, theologians, just people in general have always been groping for some pithy way to capture the essence of what it means to be a human being. And I know that you all know this because you're familiar with the term that we use to refer to ourselves as a species, Homo sapiens. And whether or not we're worthy of that designation, one line of thought proposes that what characterizes us as a unique form of life is that we're wise and rational animals. Move to defer discussion of the merits of that proposition for the moment. But as some of you also know, that's not the only designation that humans have been characterized by. I know some of you all, who's heard of Homo ludens, the idea that we're uniquely playful animals? How about Homo faber, the idea that we're tool-producing, working animals? How about Homo aestheticus from Ellen Dissanayake of Seattle, who says, following Aristotle, that we're fundamentally aesthetic animals? And I think all of those are pretty good as heuristic designations that draw our attention to aspects of human activity that surely define us. However, what I'd like to do tonight to commemorate Ernest Becker's ideas is to just toss one other designation on the table. In the book that we just wrote, we call it Homo Mortalis. And here we're just following a whole bunch of historical strands. Anyone ever hear of the Scottish essayist Alexander Smith in the 1830s or so? He wrote an essay where he said, "It is our knowledge that we must die that makes us human." And then William James, a couple of decades later, frames that same idea in religious terms when he says, oh, death is the worm at the core of the human experience. The idea, you're familiar with the Garden of Eden. Again, we weren't there, but we know that when Eve partakes of the apple from the tree of knowledge, that's what brings death into the world. And then we also know, almost a century later, that Ernest Becker, in a whole lot of work, I would say in books, The Birth and Death of Meaning, in the book The Denial of Death, in the book Escape from Evil, he elaborated on that basic idea that it is the knowledge that we must die that makes us human, and won a Pulitzer Prize for his efforts. But I think more importantly, has just really crystallized a whole lot of historical strands of thought from a variety of disciplines that I think really in many ways just captures the essence of what it means to be a human being. All right, so let me tell you very briefly, classic comic book overview of Ernest Becker's depiction of the motivational underpinnings of human behavior, drawing from a whole wide variety of disciplinary sources. What Becker asks us to do in The Birth and Death of Meaning is to just start with a relatively simple assumption from Darwin, and that is that human beings share with all other forms of life a basic biological predisposition towards surviving in the service of self-preservation and reproduction. And I'm in Canada, so I think I can get away with that without too much pushback. All right, but it's true. All right, so head shakes because I'm tired. I was in Scotland the other day, so it's like 4 a.m. there, so I'm a little wobbly. But who remembers Darwin's Origin of the Species, second chapter, the struggle for survival, where Darwin just says, hey, living things like to stay alive. Right, but Darwin then also pointed out that lots of different forms of life over literally billions of years have adapted to their surroundings in a variety of sublimely beautiful ways in order to persist over time. So you've got the giraffe with a long neck, and you've got eagles with tremendous eyesight. You've got dogs that have a great sense of smell, and so on and so forth, which raises the question, Becker argues, of why is it that we're not only here, but we're such a radically successful species. All right, now, we do have some very good physical attributes going for us. We're upright and bipedal. We've got an opposable thumb, stereoscopic, binocular vision, all very, very handy. But what keeps us alive, Becker proposes, is that by virtue of our enlarged forebrain, we have sophisticated cognitive capacities mediated by language that enable us, and only us, to think abstractly and symbolically to the point where we can imagine things that don't yet exist, and then have the audacity to transform our dreams into reality. And the example that I'm stuck on, because I think it's one that we're all familiar with, would be Da Vinci drawing little pictures of helicopters in his notebooks in the 1500s. And what did people say when he did that? Yeah, they said, you're crazy, and yet today, here we are routinely transported by what was originally denounced as the doodlings of a madman. And I like the way that Becker puts it, relying on one of his intellectual heroes, Otto Rank. Rank said, only human beings make the unreal real. All other creatures must accept the world in the form in which they encounter it. Only human beings, if they're not satisfied with their surroundings, can imagine alternative possibilities and then render them real. And I hope we can agree that that's pretty handy for staying alive. And so we're here in part because of our vast intelligence in the form of symbolic and abstract thought. Right, what Becker does then, though, in the denial of death is to kind of move back in time. Darwin's in the 1850s, 1860s. And he then says, well, let's go back a couple of decades and let's think about the Danish existential philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. And I know many of you are familiar with Kierkegaard, who way ahead of his time, because this is really before psychology even existed, Kierkegaard said, human beings are so smart that we realize that we exist. In psychological discourse these days, they call it self-awareness or consciousness. And I think that, again, when I talk about this, where I teach at Skidmore, I just ask the students, I'm like, wow, who's aware of the fact that you're sitting here now listening to me or pretending to do so while you hallucinate about lunch? And most of the students are able to acknowledge that they're not only here, but they're aware of that fact. And then just to be playful, I say, well, who's ever been walking down the street thinking to yourself, here I am walking down the street? Anybody ever do that? All right, how about this? Here I am walking down the street thinking about that I'm walking down the street. You ever walk down the street thinking about that you're thinking that you're walking down the street? And the point that Kierkegaard wants to make, I think, is important and profound, and that is that we take self-consciousness for granted because we're just basically surrounded by it. And yet, Kierkegaard insists that it is a uniquely human affectation, perhaps mediated by language, because it takes a ridiculously sophisticated cognitive apparatus to render yourself the object of your own subjective inquiry. And what Kierkegaard says is, hey, a rose bush exists but doesn't necessarily know it. A raccoon exists but doesn't necessarily know it. You exist and you know it. All right, and those are the two assumptions that we need in order for Becker's theorizing to get off the proverbial ground. Living things like to stay alive, and so do we. And we are aware of the fact that we exist. So how are we doing so far? Head shakes, if that's okay. All right, then. Vodka, awesome. All right, so anyway, and then little thin volume that Kierkegaard wrote called Fear and Trembling, which I always suggest is good for a gift for your in-laws. Kierkegaard said, once you are self-conscious, you will necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that he referred to as awe and dread, respectively. And very simply, what Kierkegaard proposed is that for a self-conscious creature, it's both awesome and dreadful. All right, let's do the awesome part for 90 seconds before we descend into the existential abyss. All right, it is awesome to be alive and to know it. Again, rhetorical question. Who's ever woken up one day just happy to be alive? You didn't win the lottery, not going to get a Nobel Prize, didn't produce any great work of art. You literally just wake up, you look around, and you're sublimely appreciative of the fact that you happen to exist. And all right, James Joyce, who knows Ulysses? I know some of you know it. Who's actually read it as opposed to using it to keep your car from rolling backwards on the driveway? So, who has finished it? Anybody finish it? You ever get to the last sentence, 50 pages, the longest sentence in the history of literature, as far as I can tell? No punctuation, no capital letters. I never got away with that when I was in school. Yet, the longest sentence in the history of literature, as far as I can tell, it starts and it ends with the same word, yes. All right, so here's Joyce just saying, yes, it is really great to be alive. So does Kierkegaard say. All right, but then he turns right around and he says, yeah, but it's also dreadful. Because unless you're a child or unless you're cognitively impaired, to be smart enough to realize that you exist carries with it the associated existential baggage that arises from the realization that, like all living things, your life is of finite duration and that you too will someday die. Moreover, Becker adds, following Kierkegaard, it's not only that you know that you will die someday that poses a psychological conundrum, it's the concurrent awareness that your death can occur at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control. And then Becker, just to add a little bit of psychological heft, takes an idea from Freud. So we don't like that we're going to die. We don't like that we could die at any time. We also don't like the fact that we're animals, that we happen to be ensconced in a corporal piece of flesh that will age and will decay and will ultimately die. And I was in Scotland, and some of you have heard me say this before, but when I was in Scotland last week, I asked folks who had seen the Elephant Man film. Has anybody seen that one? And a lot of the Scots had. That was a big film over in Scotland. And I was like, remember when the Elephant Man says, I am not an animal? And you're like, go, Mr. Pachyderm, I'm with you. But au contraire, the Elephant Man is an animal, and so are you. And as Becker points out, whether we like it or not, we're essentially breathing pieces of defecating meat that from a purely biological perspective are no more enduring or significant than cucumbers or cockroaches. And the point that Becker makes is that if we were constantly aware of the reality of the human condition, we are transient, ephemeral creatures. microscopic specks of respiring biological protoplasm born in a time and place not of our choosing, living for an infinitesimal amount of time before we tumble into the abyss, we wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. We would literally be, I can't stand up after I just said that. I feel like crawling under the podium, but yeah, oh, good point, thank you. So, what Becker proposes, literally, is that we would be paralyzed by abject terror if that's all we thought about. I'm going to die. I could walk outside and get smote by a meteor. I'm a breathing piece of defecating meat. And what he proposed is that our ancestors somehow, quite ingeniously, although very likely quite unconsciously, solved the existential dilemma of the potentially crippling anxiety engendered by the awareness of death, which was in turn an unanticipated byproduct of our vast intelligence through the creation and maintenance of what anthropologists call culture. I'm looking at my clock. I'm going to get a watch someday, but not today. All right, so, and according to the anthropologists, and according to Becker, culture consists of humanly constructed beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with other people in our group that serves to reduce death anxiety by giving us each a sense that we're valuable people in a meaningful universe. And so in The Birth and Death of Meaning, Becker introduces terms that I like because they're straightforward. He says, you know, our psychological equanimity requires that we believe that life has meaning and that we as individuals have value. So he points out, he's an anthropologist, he says, look, all cultures have a description of the origin of the universe. All cultures have a prescription of how we ought to behave while we're here. All cultures offer some hope of immortality, either literally through the heavens, afterlife, souls, and reincarnations of the world's great religions, or symbolically through having children, amassing great fortunes, writing great symphonies, scientific discoveries, and so on and so forth. And that's what gives us a sense that we have meaning. And then we also need to feel that as individuals we have value. And what he proposes is that every society has social roles, and social roles are associated with particular standards of achievement. And if we can approximate or exceed those standards, then we can perceive ourselves as significant individuals in a world of meaning. And if we're lucky enough to be able to do that, that's what Ernest Becker called self-esteem. And he said self-esteem is the dominant human motive, not to be confused with narcissism, by the way. If I can remember, I'll try and make a distinction later on down the trail, or let's talk about this when we're floating around. But in a nutshell, this is my sense of what Ernest Becker is essentially arguing, that we are unique amongst living things because we're intelligent enough to become aware of our own existence. This is both exhilarating as well as devastating because it makes us aware that we're going to die. We can die at any time, and that we're ephemeral animals. And in order to assuage the potentially debilitating terror that arises from those realizations, we embed ourselves in cultural worldviews that give us each a sense that we're valuable members of a meaningful universe. And because of that, whether we're aware of it or not, we are highly motivated at all times to maintain a sense of confidence in our cultural worldviews and a concurrent belief in our value in the context of the cosmological drama to which we subscribe. All right, so two things. So what? And how do we know this is true? And so what is like, well, all right, what do we gain from these ideas? When we talk about, well, what's the function of the university? Surely it's not the only one, but the hope is that we can generate ideas that help us understand ourselves and the world around us. And then another question is, well, how do we know that these ideas have merit? Although Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for the denial of death, he was generally dismissed by academic psychologists as kind of an interesting but nevertheless speculative poet, because the argument was that his ideas coming from psychoanalysis and coming from existential philosophy were too abstract to ever be amenable to be subjected to empirical scrutiny. And so what I've been doing with my colleagues, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski, for the last 35 years is to design and conduct experiments, both in the lab and in the world, that test hypotheses that are derived from what we call terror management theory. And terror management theory was just our effort to take all of Ernest Becker's books and to shrink it down to a paragraph or two of declarative theoretical statements from which we could derive hypotheses that could then be tested. All right, so what I want to do, and still finish in time for the reception, because I'm the only thing between you and snacks and drinks, is let's do so what and how do we know that this is true at the same time. Let me bounce through some of the areas that I think Becker's ideas are profoundly illuminating with regard to helping us understand the vagaries of the human condition. And then along the way, let me describe, at least briefly, the research that we've done that bears on some of these claims. We got interested in Becker's ideas because as graduate students, we were really trying to figure out, Jeff and Tom and I, how come people can't get along with other human beings who don't share their beliefs about the nature of reality. All right, back to James Joyce. I know you didn't finish the book, but who started it? Anybody get even 10 or 20 pages through? All right, page 9 of Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus says, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awaken." And the point that Joyce is making is that even the most benevolent glance at human history reveals an unflattering depiction of humankind. It's literally been one ongoing genocidal atrocity juxtaposed with the brutal subjugation of designated in-house inferiors. And if you read the newspaper or watch TV these days, I see no signs that these affectations have abated in the least. And Ernest Becker was tremendously concerned, in fact, almost singularly concerned with trying to understand what he ultimately came in his last book to call evil. What is it about us that we can't seem to tolerate another human being who worships a different God, who sings a different song, salutes a different flag? And what Becker did was to offer two, I think, profoundly disarming insights. One of them is very straightforward, and it is as follows. If your beliefs about the nature of reality serve a death-denying function, then whenever you run into somebody who doesn't share those beliefs, that's a problem whether you're aware of it or not, because very simply, if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you necessarily undermine the confidence with which you subscribe to your own, and then you expose yourself to the very anxiety that your beliefs were created to mitigate in the first place. And so what Becker proposed is that the mere existence of people who are different is psychologically problematic. Headshakes if that makes sense, because I hope that does. All right, and then he says, oh yeah, but there's something else that may be even more discomforting, and this is as follows. Here he's following William James, and he says, you know, our cultural constructions, our religions, our politics, our economics are very, very powerful. And at their best, they really do serve to reduce death anxiety by giving us the uplifting sense that we're valuable creatures in a meaningful universe. Nevertheless, they are, however, symbolic, whereas the problem of death is very physical. And what Becker insisted is that no symbol, and here he's following William James, no symbol is potent enough to ever completely eradicate death anxiety. And therefore, there's always going to be what we call residual death anxiety. Becker called it the rumbling of panic beneath the surface of consciousness. And then he said what we do with that residual death anxiety is we repress it, but because that's so unpleasant, we project it onto other individuals or group of individuals that we declare the all-encompassing repositories of evil that we must then destroy in order to rid the world of evil. So in one of the most striking statements in the book, Escape from Evil, Becker points out the poignant irony that most of the evil in the world comes from people trying to rid the world of evil. And what he points out is that when we do run into people who are different, the first thing that we do is we belittle or berate them. Of course, I believe that God created the earth in 6 days, but the people of the Fulani tribe in Mali, they believe the earth was created out of a giant drop of milk. Yeah, but those poor bastards are living in tents, wearing grass skirts, worshiping piles of sticks and mud. They don't have iPhones and iPads. I'm being silly. I hope you understand this. And the reason I'm being silly, but there's an important point to be made here, is that does it make sense when you belittle the possessor of an alternative conception of reality, you spare yourself the trouble of doubting your own? And if we had more time, I would try to demonstrate to each of us that we all do that. It's unfortunate, but it happens to be true. Some of us then automatically correct for that tendency, but our first reaction to people who are different is to belittle or berate. The next thing that we do, or we do it at the same time, is we try and get people to dispose of their ideas and to adopt ours instead. Christian missionaries are very good, but so are political proselytizers and Tupperware salespeople. I don't know if they have those up here. And then, if that doesn't work, just kill those people, thus proving that your ideas and your God is superior after all. And what Ernest Becker asks us to consider is the unsettling possibility that one of the reasons, and one of the primary reasons why we can't get along with people who are different, is that the mere existence of those differences is psychologically unsettling because it makes it more difficult for us to confidently retain our own death-denying belief systems. All right, so how do we know if this is true? May seem true, but how do we know? So what Jeff and Tom and I did 35 years ago, if you're going to have an idea in science, it's going to usually happen young. So we had one 35 years ago. We were sitting around at our intramural bowling team, and that's what happened. I'd like to say, we were in class, and it happened as a result of some protracted discussion with our erudite professors. But no, we were in a rather jocular, inebriated stupor, trying to get the ball down the alley. And we're like, yeah, we have a great idea. What would happen if we asked some people to think about themselves dying, and let's ask other people to think about something unpleasant but not fatal? You're going to the dentist and getting a root canal. You're in a car accident. You have to have a leg chopped off. You're giving a speech in public and you vomit on the table and everyone's mortified and you're ostracized. All kinds of negative but not fatal things. And what we thought is that if Becker's right, then when you're reminded of your mortality, that should make your need for your culturally constructed beliefs more necessary. And we should be able to detect that by assessing your reactions to different people, people who either support your beliefs or people who are opposed to them. And what we reasoned is that when you're reminded of your mortality, you should like people who share your beliefs a lot more, and you should hate people who are different. Head shakes if that makes sense. All right, so then we designed a little thing. We call it mortality salience, and that's when we ask people to think about themselves dying. All right, sometimes we do it in the lab. We bring them in and we have them fill out a little questionnaire. Just jot down the thoughts and feelings that you have when you think about your own death. Sometimes we ask people to watch gory films of like electrocutions or car crashes. Sometimes we go outside and we stop people either in front of a funeral parlor or 100 meters to either side. The thought being that if you're stopped in front of a funeral parlor, that may bring intimations of mortality to mind. And then, most importantly, for those of you that may have some methodological sophistication, we have another technique where we bring people into the lab and they think that they're reading stuff on a computer, and while they're reading, we flash the word death so fast, 28 milliseconds, that you can't see anything. And in the control condition, we use the word field, same length, same frequency of occurrence in the English language. And the point that I want to make, because I want to get done before the sun rises, is that all of these different ways of making people momentarily aware of their mortality produce the same effects. But I think the most compelling and convincing demonstrations are the ones with the subliminal death primes where you don't even know that death is on your mind. All right, so what happens when we remind people of death? All right, well, when Christians are reminded of death, they like fellow Christians a lot more, and they hate Jewish people. When Jewish people are reminded of death, they like Jewish people a lot more, and they hate Arabs and Christians. When Indians, like in India, are reminded of death, they love Indians. They hate Pakistanis. When Australian Aborigines are reminded of death, they love Aborigines and they hate white people, and rightfully so, I might add, at least in that particular setting. All right, so the point is, and that effect has been reproduced in over 500 studies by independent researchers in more than 20 countries on 5 continents. I say that not to boast so much as to establish that this effect is very robust and replicable outside of our laboratory. See, it doesn't count if you're the only ones who produce a phenomenon. Cold fusion happened, but just once, and it's got to happen more than once. It's got to happen in independent settings. All right, moreover, we know that reminders of death don't only influence your attitudes, they also influence your behavior. So Germans reminded of their mortality, they sit closer to fellow Germans, and they sit further away from people who appear to be Turkish. Iranians, reminded of their mortality, become more supportive of suicide bombing and more willing to become suicide bombers themselves. Americans, reminded of their mortality, become more supportive of preemptive biological, nuclear, and chemical war against countries who pose no direct threat to us. All right, I could say a lot more about this, but let me just finish. I like George Bernard Shaw. Anybody like his plays? Love Shaw, and I think this is Heartbreak Hotel, where Shaw says, when the angel of death sounds his trumpet, the pretenses of civilization are blown from men's head into the mud like hats in a gust of wind. So I think when Ernest Becker says that concerns about mortality underlie our inability to get along with people who are different, I think he's on the right track. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about how existential concerns make human beings susceptible to supporting a particular kind of leader that Max Weber called charismatic leaders that they might not otherwise support. Ernest Becker wrote some brilliant things in The Denial of Death as well as Escape from Evil based on what Max Weber said, which is that in times of historical upheaval, when the psychological shit hits the fan, if you'll pardon the expression, we are likely to become attracted to and supportive of what he called charismatic leaders, seemingly larger-than-life people who often believe or are believed by their followers to be divinely ordained to rid the world of evil. Becker wrote about Hitler and how Hitler's rise to power, he was, after all, elected somewhat, may have been the result of existential concerns due to the aftermath of World War I. Well, anyway, I was working at Brooklyn College, and I was in Lower Manhattan on September 11th, 2001, when the World Trade Center fell down, as well as the attack on the Pentagon. And I know a lot of you were alive then, unlike the Skidmore students that I now talk to, but who remembers that President George W. Bush was not particularly highly regarded until September 11th? He had the lowest approval rating in the history of presidential polling. 3 weeks later, President Bush had the highest approval rating, and this was amongst Democrats as well as Republicans. And one possibility is that Bush had metamorphosized from a relatively mediocre person who rarely transcended the monosyllabic utterance to an effective leader, engaging in incredibly and profoundly effective instrumental behavior. Another possibility is he didn't really change that much, but Americans did. That the events of September 11th were like an ambulatory mortality salience reminder. And we did a series of studies where we demonstrated that when we reminded Americans of their mortality, it profoundly increased their support for President Bush and his policies in Iraq. In fact, in one study that we did 5 weeks before the 2004 presidential election, we walked up to Americans registered to vote who intended to vote. We randomly divided them into two groups. One group thought about death, another group thought about something unpleasant. And we asked them who you're going to vote for, secret ballot. Just write down on a piece of paper who you're going to vote for. And what we found is that in control conditions, our respondents said they intended to vote for Senator John Kerry by a 4-to-1 margin. However, the participants who were reminded of their mortality, they said that they intended to vote for President Bush by a 3-to-1 margin. I don't know, think about the implications of that. I was interviewed by the BBC right after we did those studies, and they said, well, what do you make of that? I'm like, well, Americans in their right mind don't seem to care for the president all that much unless existential concerns are aroused. I don't want to dredge up old times, and I don't know how relevant this is up north, but some of you may remember that John Kerry was literally ahead 4 days before that election, before Osama bin Laden put out another tape threatening to bludgeon us. And I don't know if you, just for comic relief, are noticing that we have another presidential election coming on. And there's a rather eclectic assortment of profoundly, potentially dangerous people that may indeed get elected, and I think perhaps for the same reason. I see the same dynamics. Maybe I'll get to come back someday, but we're doing studies right now to see if Americans' support for Donald Trump is also the result of existential concerns. All right, let's move on. Let's look at another area besides political preferences. Let's look at how existential concerns influence our discomfort with nature and our disregard for the natural environment. Ernest Becker wrote a lot about the fact that if his ideas are correct, then we should be uncomfortable with nature because, after all, anything in nature is ultimately finite. That's the psychological impetus for the construction and maintenance of super nature. And because our bodies are, like it or not, products of nature, that when existential concerns are aroused, we should be particularly uncomfortable with our carcasses and bodily functions. All right, sure enough, our studies have shown that when we remind people of their mortality, they deny vociferously that humans are animals. When we remind people of their mortality, their attitudes towards animals get more negative. They have more negative attitudes towards animals and are more willing to kill them for reasons other than food and medical research. When we remind people of their mortality, they become very uncomfortable with our own bodily functions, not only ones that would be obvious like excretion, but it also makes us uncomfortable with sexual activity. And Becker said death and sex are twins, because when we're reminded of our mortality, engaging in sexual activity reminds us that we are basically, copulating pieces of meat who, after we take a lap around the track of life, pass the proverbial baton to the next generation before we join just the legions of the unliving and unremembered. All right, when we're reminded of death, it also makes us treat nature differently. We are much more uncomfortable in natural surroundings. So there's some amazing Dutch researchers who have shown that under normal psychological conditions, people love nature. If you show people pictures of nature and then you show them like suburban neighborhoods where everybody's got a picket fence and rows of hedges and stuff, people love the forest more than the suburbs. But when you remind people of death, they love the suburbs and they no longer like the forests. When you remind people of death and you ask them to participate in a simulated resource management game where they're harvesting timber and where they're told, you know what, if you take too much timber, you're going to ruin the forest and there'll be no more wood left. People reminded of their mortality, they don't care. They just greedily extract natural resources to the point where there may not be enough of them to go around. All right, part and parcel with the desecration of the environment that Becker, I suspect, would argue is a manifestation of death anxiety, is what he referred to as mindless, conspicuous consumption, or what Kierkegaard referred to as being tranquilized with the trivial. Do they have shopping in Canada? I don't know what everybody does up here, but we have a lot of it in the U.S. And another one of my favorite Ernest Becker phrases is at the end of The Denial of Death, when Becker says, the average person spends most of their time either drinking or shopping, which is the same thing. And I think an empirical case could be made for that. How about Tennessee Ernie Williams, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof? Do you know that play? Oh, Tennessee Williams, yes. What is it, Tennessee Ernie Ford? Oh, that's a bad dream. We don't want to conflate them. All right, so Tennessee Williams, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Remember Big Daddy? The human animal is a beast that dies, and if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason that he buys everything that he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he's got the crazy idea that one of his purchases could be life everlasting. All right, Becker writes in Escape from Evil a remarkable chapter called Money, the New Immortality Ideology, where he points out that literally shopping and the acquisition of stuff has replaced religious beliefs in a secular universe where the Judeo-Christian tradition that had bound us together for thousands of years has no longer served many of us as a compelling belief system. All right, sure enough, when you remind people of their mortality, they have higher fiscal aspirations. They say they want to make a lot more money. When you remind people of their mortality, they want more stuff, but not just any stuff. They want fancy, high-status stuff like a Rolex and a Lexus. All right, when you remind people of death and you ask them to draw pictures of coins and paper money, they literally draw bigger pictures. So money looms larger when death is on our minds. And here's my favorite one, although this is not favorite in quotes because it's incredibly discombobulating. A group of Polish researchers recently, they gave one group of people a stack of money, and they said, here, count this money. They gave another group of people a stack of pieces of paper and said, here, count the pieces of paper. Now, they didn't let the people keep the money, but after counting either money or paper, they measured death anxiety, and the people who counted money, their death anxiety went down. All right, in the U.S., I meant to bring $1. Where's Merlin? Where's Merlin? We had $1 earlier, but each of us, we were lost when we got off the train. And so a gentleman approached us in need of food, and we're like, oh, we just got here. We don't have any money. And he's like, oh, I take U.S. So we gave him our dollars, but he did show us where we needed to go. So I think it was an equitable exchange. Anyway, I meant to have a dollar bill because if you look at the back of the U.S. dollar bill, who's ever seen one where it says, "In God we trust"? And who's ever seen the picture of the pyramid on the back of the dollar bill with the little eyeball coming out of the top of the pyramid, which, as Joseph Campbell points out, is an ancient Egyptian symbol of immortality? All right, well, on top of that, remember Becker says we're either shopping or drinking. It's the same thing. When we remind people of their mortality and offer them alcohol, they chug it. When we remind people of their mortality, people who smoke cigarettes, when we measure how much they suck on the cigarette, they inhale twice as hard, suggesting that there are death-denying affectations that are influencing those behaviors. Let me tell you one more, and then we'll wrap it up, or at least I'll try and sum it up. And this has to do with epidemic levels of psychopathology in North America right now. Just speaking for Los Estados Unidos, where I come from, depression is at an all-time high. National Institute of Mental Health says that 12% of the population of America is depressed, and a third of the adults in the U.S. will be depressed at some point in their lives. And Becker thought about this at great length, and he made a profoundly poignant observation, and that is that when you have a large segment of any community that appears to be in a state of psychological dis-ease, and I want to put a hyphen there because I don't want to medicalize these difficulties, that we ought to look at the values that are intrinsic to the culture to see if they're realistically attainable by the average person in it. And the point that he made, and he made this 40 years ago, but it's more true today, is that we teach our children to strive for things that are not realistically attainable. We tell our kids in America to subscribe to the American dream, which is that if you work hard enough, you can have as much money as Steve Jobs, Donald Trump, or Bill Gates. And if you don't, it's your fault. And then we tell women that if I can't floss my teeth with you, you're too fat, so you have to be thinner than a piece of linguine, and you have to stay perpetually young. And the point is that most of us are not going to be richer than Donald Trump. Most of us are not going to be thinner than pieces of linguine. None of us are going to remain forever young, to borrow a phrase from Bob Dylan. And the point that Becker made is that this is a recipe for psychological despair. We are gestating a generation of kids for whom it is no longer psychologically viable to be average. Old-timers, who remembers our day when it was okay to be just okay? Right, those days are gone. If I give a kid at Skidmore a C, they just commit ritual suicide and disembowel themselves in the parking lot. And I'll just say, that's like average. The average person's average. What are you doing? And so I think that this helps us explain rampant levels of psychological disorders in our culture. All right, so what? All right, well, at the end of Escape from Evil, it's actually in the beginning of Escape from Evil. Ernest Becker takes a line from a Thomas Hardy novel where he says, if a way to the better there be, it comes from taking a close look at the worst. And then he says, well, you know, I am pessimistic, but I'm not cynical. And I think this is an important distinction. He said, yeah, you know, I'm kind of pessimistic because malignant manifestations of death anxiety surely do not bring out the best in us. And according to what I've said, just for the few minutes we've been together, you know, literally at our worst, we are disillusioned, hateful, warmongering, proto-fascist, plundering the planet in our insatiable lust for dollars and dross, in a perpetual television, Facebook, drug and alcohol stupor. That's bad. All right, but, and to make it worse for a moment, by the end of Escape from Evil, Ernest Becker said, yeah, I don't even know if we're going to make it. I don't even know if humans are a viable form of life. Or as Robert J. Lifton puts it in a book called Destroying the World to Save It, if things progress as they currently are, we may be the first form of life to have the ignominious distinction of being responsible for our own extinction. All right, but, and this is a big but, the Escape from Evil book ends on a high note of sorts when Becker turns around and says, okay, that's bad. I'm pessimistic, but I'm not cynical. All right, so what's the upside? Well, the upside is that historically, humans have a pretty good track record of extricating ourselves from some very dire situations once we're aware of what it is that's producing them. I think the best example that I can come up with at this point would be the plague in the Middle Ages. It was wiping out large chunks of Europe, and as long as we thought that the plague was caused by evil spirits, we didn't get very far. We did exorcisms, we made people drink potions of red wine and sheep shit, we dipped them in cold water, we spun them around on merry-go-rounds, still had the plague. All right, then we figure out that it's bacteria, and once we figure that out, we invent penicillin and modern medicine arises. All right, by the same token, I don't think it is naive to propose that maybe the same can happen here. Specifically, if we can come to recognize the extent to which death anxiety, and by the way, I think you said this earlier, Larry, so let me finish just by reaffirming your point. It's not death anxiety per se that produces troubling and difficult outcomes. It's rather death anxiety that's repressed, and when we bury it under the psychological bushes, it comes back to bear malignant fruit. That's the problem. And so I'll leave you with two things. Who knows Albert Camus? I know some of you do. I love Camus, who in his notebooks scribbled, "Come to terms with death. Thereafter, anything is possible." All right, maybe an overstatement, but certainly something to strive for. And then one other thing, and this is Erik Erikson. I know some of you know Erikson's work. Anybody know The 8 Stages of Man? I love that book also, and I love the last sentence where Erikson says something along the lines, when parents have the courage to die, their children will have the faith to live. And I think that's a nice way to end, and the best way, perhaps at least for me, to honor Ernest Becker's legacy, because he was all about faith, courage, and imagination, in the hopes that if we can properly deploy them, things will be just a tad better tomorrow than maybe they are today. All right, so thank you very much. I look forward to the rest of the time. Thank you. I'm happy to do that, or we can just circulate. That's up to you. I'll see that next time that I heard. Okay.
There's not much to add to that. There can be some Q&A. Would you like a little Q&A with Sheldon, or we can just go to the reception and you can mingle? I think that's what Sheldon would like to do. Has anybody got a pressing? Yes.
Just a point of information. I want to let folks know that the Ernest Becker Foundation team are going to have copies of Sheldon's book, War Metaphor, tomorrow at the conference, so come see us if you're interested. You can get them to sign it.
In addition, you're sponsoring a reception with Sheldon, get to meet Sheldon, share cocktails and canopies with Sheldon. That's tomorrow night.
We have a handful of tickets left, so let us know if you're interested in coming. It's at Bambuda Restaurant, which is fabulous right near here.
Okay, so let's call it a night. We'll just mingle around, get to know each other a little bit, meet back here tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Thanks for coming.